Well, the major parties have a tough job ahead of them as they try to convince voters of their respective energy policies. Peter Dutton has placed nuclear at the centre of the coalition's re-election strategy. Anthony Albanese has touted renewables as a way for the future. So what do Australians think? They're probably just sick of the 20 years or more so of a lack of bipartisanship. Joining me now is RedBridge Group Director Simon Welsh. Simon, energy is coming a lot up in the focus groups at the moment. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right, Laura. It's one of those zombie issues. It just never seems to go away. And it's sort of, there's always three bits to the energy conversation. There's always a conversation about prices, there's a conversation about climate, and there's increasingly this interesting conversation around sort of reliability of supply, the fact that the power will be there when we switch the switch on sort of thing. And I suppose what's interesting within that is there's not a whole lot of belief that government can do much around prices. They sort of see the privatisation genie's out of the bottle, not happy about it, but we don't think there's a whole lot that government can do around prices other than, the subsidies here and there and those sorts of things. But the reliability and climate stuff is really fascinating. And there's some interesting things going on there. And I think looking at the nuclear side of the coin first, because I think there's, as I say, some interesting stuff there, which is, unsurprisingly, there isn't a great deal of support around it. It's actually pretty hard to have a conversation in the focus groups about nuclear without the Simpsons coming up. So we're calling it the Simpsons effect, the Mr. Burns effect around nuclear. But it reveals an interesting thing, which is even amongst those voters who are, in theory, sort of open to or a bit pro-nuclear, and it tends to be sort of younger males, university-educated. The problem that then runs into, and what makes that support quite soft, is that group is perhaps the most cynical, the most distrustful of government and of big business. So when you ask them, okay, in theory we support nuclear, who would you trust to run it?
Right.
Silence. You get this sort of silence. It's like, oh, gee, yeah, that's a good point. Because I don't trust government to run it. I don't trust big business to run it. So the support is quite soft, even amongst those that are sort of reporting that they are pro-nuclear.
So, Simon, just to reiterate that, it's something that I hadn't thought about before with the nuclear. I mean, the nuclear idea has a few hairs on it, I would say. I think the core of the intention there is the correct one, and that is baseload reliable power. And yes, other nations are doing it. The time that it would take to construct is an issue. The cost is also an issue. But when you talk to voters about this, it doesn't just invoke the Simpsons. The trust issue is the biggest one.
That is the core thing, as I say, from even those folk that would describe themselves as, and do describe themselves in the groups as pro-nuclear, is this idea of, yes, we know this is a complicated technology. We know there are downsides to this technology, so it requires really close and careful management in a broader context of erosion of trust of our institutions. It's been going on for decades now, and we see that across society. It's kind of like the wrong idea at the wrong time. It just asks too much of voters in terms of those levels of trust.
I wonder if the circumstances, play into it a little bit. And I say that yes, I think people believe in the renewables drive, but really both sides of politics are banking on technology that doesn't really exist right now. Nuclear being one of them, small scale, it does exist, but, it's still in its kind of infancy. It takes a little while to do. The other one is batteries and being able to actually supply the masses with electricity when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. Is there a problem there with the renewable drives from the Labor side?
Yeah, you've put your finger on a really fascinating thing. So what's happening is there's almost like this implicit social contract, which is that most, not all, but most of the folk that we're talking to, and you can see it in polling as well, most voters are willing to go on the renewables journey. Yet we're willing to accept that renewables are the solution to the supply issues, to the climate issue. It's a neat solution, willing to come on that journey with you. The contract of that, though, is that you governments will ensure that those technologies and those sources of power are in place so that we don't run into blackouts and brownouts and all sorts of supply issues. And what they don't see is there's a real fuzziness about how we're progressing on that front. So, yeah, we're all aware of the targets and, yeah, good, terrific, thumbs up. But what we don't see is, well, what's happening to make that happen? You know, where's the progress? Where's the big infrastructure projects? We don't sort of see the dirt flying from wheels spinning, and that's creating an anxiety. So that there is definitely an anxiety around our readiness for that transition.
The oft-repeated, I guess, statement from the Labor side of things is that renewables are by far the cheapest. Yes, they are, but when you've got to spend, you know, say $50 billion on upgrading transmission lines, the cost still flows through. So I wonder, living in the middle of a cost of living and housing crisis that seems intractable at the moment, how does that affect voter thinking and behaviour when it comes to this energy plan?
Yeah, so the cost of living effects of energy, again, are really interesting in themselves. So, as I mentioned, that there's not a great deal of sort of government blame directly on energy prices, other than, you know, it's governments, it's the major parties that sort of unleashed privatisation in this area that, you know, people will talk about should be an essential service and those sorts of things. So there's sort of this historical blame around it. When you sort of then try and press them on, well, what do you think this renewable transition is going to do to energy prices? The sort of, I suppose the most positive view is, look, we know it's going to cost billions, maybe more, and trillions to do this energy transition. But in the longer run, we suspect that will be a cheaper outcome. But look, that might be 10, 15, 20 years away before we kind of get to that point. And even then they'll sort of qualify it. When they say cheaper, they say, oh, not necessarily cheaper than what we're paying today, but cheaper than what we would have been paying if we were still relying on fossil fuels. The other group of people sort of say, we're going to get, you know, screwed in this deal whichever way happens, because of that privatisation story, the big companies will get you every way they can, and, you know, once they've managed to increase prices, those prices aren't coming back down again. So again, there's this kind of cynicism. So using it as a kind of cost of living solution doesn't pass the sniff test for most voters.
Simon, it is always fascinating to talk to you. Can't wait to see what you throw up next week from the groups. Appreciate it.